Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro. Today we're starting our 12 Days of Michters with the US1 Series. What's up everybody, Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. Thank you so much for liking this video, commenting on it, sharing with your friends, and subscribing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. 75% of you that are watching this aren't subscribed, and it helps me so immensely if you just click that little button. That's all you need to do. It helps me out so much, guys. Today, we are starting on quite an adventure. The 12 Days of Michters. It's actually 13 days. It's hard to count sometimes, but the 12 Days of Michters basically involves me trying everything I can get my hands on from the Michters product lineup, including some things that are not very easy to get your freaking hands on. So I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to going through all these different products. You know, part of what's so exciting about this is not just being able to try all these cool products, but being able to compare them next to each other. Not just try the US1 Rye and the US1 Sour Mash, but how do those compare to their toasted cousins or the barrel strength versions? That's the kind of comparison we get to do in this series. But today we're starting off with the regular editions of each of the Michters. That is the US1 series. Why is it called US1? Well, you have to know about the history of the Michters distillery. Michters actually started... I don't know why this is tilting forward so much. I'm really worried about it. We'll see how that goes. Michters actually started under a different name. John Shank started Shank's Distillery in the 1700s in Pennsylvania. Now, allegedly, he sold whiskey to George Washington to help give the soldiers some vim and vigor during the Revolutionary War. I don't know if that's true or not, but everybody loves a good story. So Shank sold whiskey to George Washington. There you go. In Pennsylvania. In the mid-1800s, the distillery was sold to Abraham Baumberger. Now, if these names are ringing a bell, it's because the Michters lineup includes products named after Shank and Baumberger. So we're going to taste those eventually, but they'll probably be sort of a separate lineup because they're really trying to do something different with those products. The Michters traditional lineup that carry the Michters name is actually kind of a consistent product and process. Now, the name Michters didn't actually come about until the 1950s when then owner Lou Foreman combined the names of his two kids, Michael and Peter, to create Michter. But between ownership by Abraham Baumberger and Lou Foreman, there were a lot of different hand changing. There was a lot of tumultuous time in the whiskey industry with Prohibition. Even shortly thereafterwards, Michters was having a hard time surviving. Eventually, with the whiskey decline in the 70s and 80s, Michters declared bankruptcy in 1989, shut its doors forever in Pennsylvania, and that was the end of the story. Except that it wasn't. In the 1990s, two guys got together who may have sort of been an unlikely pair. Dick Newman, who was the former president of Austin Nichols of Wild Turkey fame, paired with Joseph Magliocco, who was a Yale and Harvard law-educated attorney, who ended up working to resurrect the dead trademark of Michters and start a distillery. It is a little bit odd to see somebody essentially buy a history, which is what's happened here. You know, the history of Michters and Baumbergers and Shanks don't really have any connection to the two people who founded the Michter distillery in Kentucky. Matter of fact, I kind of have a problem with that. That this was a brand from Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania, and it died in Pennsylvania, and now it's being brought back in Kentucky. That seems kind of weird and a little suspicious. But if they make good products and their business practices are above board, I'm not sure how much I care about the story. The story is a fun element, and it's nice to have a history, but I also like supporting brand new products who have no history, who are trying to start something new and different. And so if that means buying an old brand and trying to resurrect it and honor your history, maybe that's worth doing. But this whole long history actually explains why this is called the US1 Series. It was the first distillery that we know of in the United States, allegedly. So the US1 Series has 4 different whiskeys in it. It has a bourbon, an American whiskey, a rye, and a sour mash. And I want to pause on the sour mash for a minute because that sort of implies that other whiskeys they are making use a sweet mash. I don't actually think that's the case. What's happening here is the history of Michter's sour mash branding. Sour mash whiskey from Michters used to be a mash bill, I believe it still is, a mash bill of 45% rye, 45% corn, and 10% malted barley. Now, why is that problematic? Well, bourbon, by definition, has to be more than 50% corn, and rye, by definition, has to be more than 50% rye. Michters also already has an American whiskey, which is using already filled barrels. It is not relying strictly on virgin oak to create the flavor profile. So if you wanted to do something that didn't fit into rye, didn't fit into bourbon, but did use the first fill casks, You got to come up with a name for it, so they named it after the process, the sour mash process. I've talked about this before, but the sour mash process essentially lets you keep some of the old spent mash in your system to add consistency and to avoid having to clean everything so thoroughly. That's enough preamble for now. Let's get to tasting whiskeys. We've got 4 to try today. I want to make sure we get through all of them and don't keep you guys too long. So the first one is the American. Now this is the lowest proof whiskey we have today. It's 41.7% alcohol. And it's the only whiskey today that is using used oak as well as new oak. Typically bourbons and a lot of American whiskeys are aged in new charred oak barrels. Well, this one is using some used barrels, which is more akin to a Scotch process. So when you nose this, you immediately get that wonderful sweet corn. It's actually a really nice nose. I pick up just a touch of that maltiness with this, along with the corn grain. There's also a little bit of a cherry note, maybe a hint of lemon. It's very light and sweet. I do get a touch of cinnamon and maybe even a touch of leather or tobacco, some sort of earthy spice, but it's pretty subtle. The main notes on this for me are that sweet grain and a hint of fruitiness. And actually, the more I keep smelling it, the more the fruitiness becomes prominent. I definitely get that cherry note. I'm starting to get some oranges as well, along with that lemon. All right, let's go ahead and taste it. So it's dangerously smooth. You do get a hint of the grain note in the mid-palate, but it's just super easy drinking, sweet, unchallenging, but still quite tasty. Ooh, and I really like the finish on this. It does wake up a little bit. You get a little bit of black pepper. You get that oakiness for sure, but it's super quiet. This is a good example of low proof not necessarily being a bad thing, because this is meant to be, I think, sort of an easy, smooth sipper. And because you still get those flavors, you don't feel like you're just drinking water. It's not boring. It's not harsh, but you still have flavor evolution. Yeah, I get sweet pipe tobacco, I get honey. I may get a touch of green apple on the palate, but generally speaking, it's more fruity on the nose than it is on the palate. The palate does have some of that sweetness. There's definitely this honeyed note, like I said, a sweetened pipe tobacco. Maybe even a touch of caramel, maybe, or maybe just creme brulee. Maybe it's just that creaminess. The mid palate on this is pretty quiet. I don't get a lot there. Maybe just a hint of a toasted almond or something, but then that finish comes back with a little bit of pepper and a little bit of oak and really rounds it out well. Even though it's the next proof point, I'm going to skip over the rye for now and save it for the end, because ryes typically are sharper and more aggressive, and I want to compare that after I've tried all these others. The proof point differences aren't that big in the US1 lineup, so I'm not too worried about it. But let's go to the sour mash. By the way, big shout out to Chris and Miranda Callahan for providing me with these samples. Appreciate you guys. They are members of my Patreon. You should be too. There's going to be some really cool exclusive content up there. There always is, in fact. I know I've put tons of stuff up there thus far in December alone, so check it out if you want to help the channel. Yeah, I don't think I did this with the bottle. Oh well. All right, so let's smell the sour mash. Wow, right off the bat, it's much richer than the American. The American is a little bit nutty, very delicate. The grain is pretty prominent, but this sour mash, you just get lots of apple. It's very appley. I get strawberries on the nose as well. Oh, I got it in my mustache because I'm so ready to drink it. You know, I actually get like a Twizzlers note. It's like very, very sweet red licorice. That is a cool note. I don't get that very often. This one really has a prominent vanilla note for me. The vanillins are really strong. Some of that could be because of their process using toasted barrels before they char them. That's kind of cool. This thing's got a lot of fruit on it. The more I sit with it, I'm getting these candied jam notes. Very berry-esque. It's not as like sugary berry as like I've gotten from Buffalo Trace store picks in the past, but it still has a very distinct like fresh ripe berry, which is beautiful. Yeah, it really makes the simple sweet grain so much more prominent on the American. This thing is just fruity and creamy. I thought the American was creamy until I tried the sour mash. Let's give it a taste. There's not a lot of mid-palate on these, and some of that I think is because the proof is so low. Ooh, but this one is a lot oakier for me personally than the American. The finish is nutty and oaky. It's almost got that dry bitterness on the finish in terms of oakiness. I don't know why I'm starting with the finish, but it's hitting me right today. Super sweet, caramel and vanilla. Not a lot else going on the palate, honestly, at the beginning at least. Mid-palate, the caramel sticks around, almost get this butterscotch note. Yep, and then that black pepper. It's funny, these are very, very similar whiskeys. The American and the Sour Mash have a lot in common in terms of the structure of the experience. It's a little bit fruity on the nose, a little bit creamy, then you taste it, it's sweet and creamy, quiet mid-palate, oaky and nutty finish. Let me see if I do a side-by-side if I can really pick those notes out. So, after going back to the American from the Sour Mash, the American's a lot oakier, it's a lot drier, and the grain's a lot more prominent. I'm surprised the rye doesn't show up more. The rye is super quiet in this mash bill. You only know the rye is there by the finish. There's a sharper, spicy component at the mid-palate finish level that pairs up with the wood, whereas you get drier oak. With the American on the finish, this is more of a spicy pepper rye, wet oak, bogged oak, which is kind of fun. I look forward to comparing that to the bourbon because this just tastes like a good bourbon to me. Now, one thing I'll note about this bourbon while I'm pouring it is that Michter's has put small batch on the bourbon, which always kind of looks like a red flag to me. You know, small batch is used all the time in so many BS ways. But I think they're actually doing small batches. According to their website, they mix the blend for their small batch bourbon in vats of 20 barrels or less. We take them at their word. That is genuinely small batch. Whoa. Wow. They keep getting sweeter. This thing, holy shit. This smells like a pretzel at the mall that's next to like a toasted nut stand. I'm getting caramel and almond. And that bready pretzel note is just really, really sticking with me. God, that's weird. Ooh, definitely getting some of this toffee. It's that buttery component mixed with the sweetness. Yeah, butterscotch, toffee, lots of deep, rich sweetnesses. Sweetnesses. I don't think that's a word. I don't care. It smells so good, though. The smell on this is really familiar. It's like bringing me back to my childhood in some weird way. I can't quite place it, but there's definitely a floral component, a rose component. The fruit on this is deeper and richer, much less berry of a ripe or a fresh or a candied nature, almost like a pie maybe. You get some of that fruitiness, but it's been manipulated somehow, cooked or something. Enough of this. I got to go ahead and taste it. Now, this is 45.7%. This is the highest proof that I've tasted so far. Highest proof I'm tasting today. And you can tell there's a little bit more oomph to it. But the beginning of this is so soft and gentle. I mean, it's definitely sweet. It's got the pepper and wood in the finish. All these whiskeys are kind of doing the same thing. They're very slight variations. I'm surprised how little difference I'm finding between these if I just don't do a direct side-by-side. And I actually really respect that. They have a vision for what their whiskey is supposed to taste like, and they're sticking with it. That's respectable. Yeah, the toasted oak flavor I'm getting, that's the distinction between the bourbon and some of these others. I'm really getting that toasted oakiness and just none of the grain. I mean, the American is super grainy compared to the bourbon. All right, last but not least, let's do this rye. Now, the rye is the only one of the batch that's a single barrel. Why the rye is a single barrel and not a small batch, I have no idea. Now, this rye is 42.4% alcohol, so it's lower than actually both the Sour Mash and the bourbon. But I wanted to do it last because ryes tend to be a little bit more oomph in their palate, so we'll see if that was a good decision or not. Ooh, I tell you on the nose, though, it's definitely different. And I really like the nose on this. That sweet grain is really pretty. So the rye grain definitely shows up. I think the sweetness here, honestly, is the most straight up sugar. I got caramel, I got creme brulee, I got honey, I got all these other sweet notes from the other three. This one is just straight up cane sugar or simple syrup and rye grain. Maybe like a toasted marshmallow, which is a good note. I also get hints of cinnamon and black pepper on the nose. And if I'm really looking for it, I get a little bit of a a coconut toasted almond. I don't know if that's a real thing or not, but I'm picking that up. All right, let's give it a try. That is a mild rye. So I do think this rye on the palate is the most like the nose in terms of the initial sweetness. Because it smells and it tastes just sort of like a simple syrup mixed with some grain. I get that creaminess, that marshmallowiness. Whereas some of these others, the sweetness was a little bit different or a little bit more muted or a little bit less defined than the nose versus palate. This one is pretty much on all fours. It's got white pepper and walnut and a little bit of dry oak. Mid-palate and finish, you definitely see that rye grain. You see a little bit of pepper show up. But overall, it's pretty mild for a rye. Usually rye is kind of throw you for a loop. How's it compared to some of these others? Man, that American was tasting like candy before. Now it just tastes like straight up dry wood. And that really brings out the rye grain doing that side by side. Let's compare it to the sour mash. Ooh, the sour mash is a lot woodier now. Finally, the bourbon. That rich caramelized sweetness, the toasted quality of the bourbon shows up. My big standout from all of this is, first off, they have a very similar profile with all their whiskeys. There are slight variations on a theme. But the thing that really stands out the most is that toasted oak quality on the standard Michter's small batch bourbon. That's pretty cool. It's kind of unique. A lot of standard issue bourbons aren't going to give you that. You're going to have to go to a double oaked or something else special. So it's just a whisper of it, but it's there. And I think that's really cool. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I look forward to doing a whole lot more of these Michter's tastings, and I'm going to continue to use the remaining samples in this bottle here to compare side by side with some of the future offerings. I will also be watering some of them down to see if they really are better at the same proof. I won't be perfect. I'm not going to match the proof exactly. I don't have a, whatever the testing thing is, I'll put the name of it down here. But I'm going to get close. I want to play around with this. I want you guys to have a very good holiday season. I'm celebrating Christmas. I don't know what y'all celebrate, but celebrate whatever you celebrate and have a good time with it. Enjoy the 12 days plus one of Michter's and keep drinking like professionals. Cheers, guys.